Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. In this bonus episode, literary agent Lucinda Halpern is back to talk about cover letters. If you're trying to get published, sign with an agent, or maybe even job hunting or applying to college, you won't want to miss this one. Lucinda, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm so psyched to do the bonus episode.
Yeah, and I mean, for people who don't know, I read Get Signed and I got signed, and you and I have had a chance to work together since you were last on here.
Yeah.
Which has been cool.
You got signed, you got the book deal. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about that, but but it's been such a meta sort of experience for us, meeting on LinkedIn, going on the podcast, you're having read the book, and now working together as agent and writer has been so great.
It's been so great. So I really appreciate you coming back. But we're talking about like a subject that basically makes me nauseous for whatever reason. And I don't know if I mean, does anybody like cover letters in your experience, like writing them?
I like them, but I'm a weirdo in that way. But maybe because I love the analogy you're drawing of cover letters to query letters is absolutely what this is. And the fact that you're the person to make that link explicit, I'm always sort of saying it. And it's the subject of the next book I'm working on. It's the same sort of, how do you present yourself in a desirable way?
It's so funny. I think that was literally just ignorance and misspeaking of equating the two. But I do want to get into the subtle differences there. But maybe let's start with cover letters, because I think most people listening, the number of people who are going to have to write a cover letter for a job or whatever,
sure,
probably outnumber the number of people who are trying to get published. What can someone learn from what you know about query letters that applies kind of broadly to these?
I guess it's always helpful to start with a common mistake or a red flag. So we, as you can imagine, publishing being a very illustrious and competitive industry, we get a lot of job applications and cover letters, and they usually look like the same exact thing. Hey, I'm Charlie. I've loved books since I was a child. I'm surrounded in books. It's been my lifelong dream to work in books. I'm actually a creative writer. I love reading X, Y, and Z sort of, usually novels, which is always sort of the wrong cue for us because we represent so much nonfiction. It's like, did you do your research? We can talk about that too. But it's the fundamental error is that it's beginning with what that person wants from you and not what you might want from that person, not how that person can be useful, not how this is a win-win in any way. So I talk about the win-win and Get Signed. It's like, why are you writing this agent in the first place? Why would they be interested in you? So that approach of it's about you and what you want and not about what the other person needs is like the first error that everyone makes as an amateur. As they get more seasoned in this, they realize, hopefully they realize, that it's much more about what the hiring person's interests are than their own.
And something we covered last time you were on here is that, someone like you or an acquisition editor, I mean, these are jobs where you're hoping, I mean, your whole livelihood depends on finding great work, and that usually starts with a query letter.
Yes, exactly. So we get really excited by great query letters that, the best query letters almost seem as though a peer or a friend is writing us, like they're on our level and they understand how we're wired, what our psychology is, what we're seeking, how to talk to us. They've demonstrated research in the books that we've represented. They'll say things like, Chris Bailey's book changed how I view productivity, or Paul Jarvis's book, I was just texting with a moment ago, changed the way I'm running a business. Kate Flanders changed the way I consume content, whatever it is. I can think of so many other examples, but it's sort of like they're talking to a friend in a very conversational way about why this would be a mutually beneficial relationship and what can get you excited. Like a pitch letter has got to get the other person excited fundamentally.
And I would imagine that applies, like, let's say you're a kid applying to colleges. You're better off talking about what excites you about a program or a professor or whatever versus like,
I think
I'm a good
so.
student, pick me.
Exactly, exactly. Like that's just so obvious when, and you think I give a lot of analogies to dating about this industry, right? If you're going out with a guy who's like, here's all about me, and they don't lock in or connect with anything that you are excited or you can bring to the table, it's just a mess.
Yeah, I was about to go there, and I love those dating analogies. And even just the idea, right, of like, you know, even just kind of wanting to find someone to marry is kind of wrong. Like
Yeah.
you should be
Yes.
looking for a connection that could become that.
Exactly. Exactly. I say somewhere where I've said before that, it's much more than an agent liking your work. When you're choosing between agents, say, it's really important to recognize what about that person, because fundamentally all agents are the same and that we all work the same way. We all should have publishing relationships. We all should be good editors. We all should be big picture thinkers. We all should know how to sell a book and negotiate a contract, right? But beyond that, there's so many different personalities to agents. And I try to identify, or the best authors will try to tell you what exactly they need. So, for example, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, CEOs who are sort of ADHD folks who, are just excited by a million things. And as one of those people, I get it fully. They need someone to focus them, to calm them down about an area where they're not confident or competent. They, they know what they don't know, so they're sort of relying on you as the expert in the room. But they have a lot of vision too. They know exactly what their audience wants and how they can serve them, so they're not afraid to like push back a little bit. So when I'm looking for clients as they're looking for me, it can be very much about what. Oh, here's a way that one client said it. I'm thinking, was that Charlie who said it? I love how one client put this. He said, I was choosing between agents and I thought about, would I want to be in the car with this person on my way to Chicago, from New York to Chicago, and the radio breaks? It's like, do I want to be sitting on the road with this
Love
person
that.
for another 5 hours? And what a great way to look at it, because this is a long road with many conversations. And if you're not going to vibe with that person and you're just signing with them because you feel like, oh, they've done all these amazing deals with these authors I've heard of, and they're taking a chance on me, and their contract kind of sucks, and I have the feeling I'm going to be dealing with their intern most of the time and not really getting face time. I have the feeling this person is not going to be spending a lot of time if the book doesn't sell. Um, all of those red flags and bad instincts are going on, but you're sort of so obsessed with the fame and fortune, you're not thinking about this the right way. You're not thinking of
Mm.
what's going to happen when the radio breaks. And that analogy can apply to so many things in publishing.
Yeah, well, it seems like let's say someone is listening to this who doesn't need any of this advice because they're amazing at the kind of cold opening that
Yeah.
goes into a cover
Yeah.
letter. That that could be query letter skills could be a way to sort of get something you don't end up wanting. If, you could get the wrong deal, the wrong agent.
Yeah. That's an
Um,
interesting thought. If you're presenting yourself the wrong way is what you mean, then you could be getting the wrong person. I mean, honestly, that's a nice problem for anyone to have, because as we know,
sure.
the brutal reality is that most people pitching agents are not hearing back at all. And they'll never have the opportunity to get in a room with one or get feedback that's meaningful. That's just the sad and true reality. So, I think where I want writers to be focused and proactive, what are the things they can do to actually break out and to capture an agent's attention from out of the slush pile?
And so that's where kind of I was going to go next. Like, what are some kind of best kept secrets there or pro tips? Because it seems like publishing, it's going to have its own culture. There are going to
Yeah.
be things where you might think you're doing the right thing, but you're actually doing something that is a dead giveaway that you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's funny, we don't care. So a lot of people worry about their amateur status in the sense of they don't know what they're doing, but you have to realize that every unknown started not knowing what they're doing. So it's not even that. But when they're starting with confidence in what they've written, even to the extent we know it's not going to be perfect, we know it's going to be rough, but they're so convinced that there's an audience for it, and they've done the research to prove that, whether it's by way of their platform, they're already connecting with people who love what they say and who keep coming back for it, or whether it's by way of you're writing fiction and it's comparative titles that look a lot like yours and are doing really well. That suggests that someone's done a little bit of research and has confidence that their book is going to break out. That's so much more meaningful than I am an expert in publishing. We do not expect you to be any sort of expert in the industry. With that said, there are a few hacks I haven't really talked about on podcasts before that if I were in the shoes of a writer, I'd be trying. One would be reading interviews with agents, obviously scouring Publishers Marketplace, because that's where like the best and most credible industry news is kept and the deals that are actively happening right now. But I would also be, reading a book like Get On or other books by industry insiders. You can actually use the language of agents and publishers, and there is jargon. There are words for example, we talk a lot about the material and we talk about his project. These are two words that just in a very subtle way, if you're using our language in your query letter, you're already achieving that kind of we're peers on the same plane. I know a little bit about this business and how you might be thinking about it. And so it's just like opens up possibilities in a way when you're even just using our language because you're mimicking it. I'm a huge believer in imitation. If we're talking about growth in one's career, I would say that I've basically accomplished everything in my career by way of imitation and then finding my own unique pivot once I had the confidence to do that. But there's so much imitation to it. So that's so that's one thing you could be doing. We talked about the win-win for both sides and how it should be much more emphasis on the person receiving the letter. But what about the broader emphasis on how readers at large are going to benefit? This is something that a lot of authors miss in their query letters too. A query letter is not what your book is about, it's why we should care.
Oh, that's great. And
Huge.
oh man, yes. And the one thing I learned you and I have been like in the trenches on a book proposal for months, and it was, and like, I think what I brought you was like, okay, but there were so many layers of work to be done. And one of the big takeaways from that experience for me was like, it is not a place to be bashful.
Yeah.
I've since been in a position to sort of help people out with their proposals. And I'm like, you need to like spell it out, like,
Yep.
especially the things about you that are impressive or command an audience or whatever.
Yes, exactly. Especially those things, right? It's like you can feel free to err on the side of arrogance and hyperbole in a pitch letter because we're sort of going to have to be, I always say just lead with your strengths is the best way to put it. It shouldn't be inauthentic, but don't forget those important things. Like I was talking to a book collaborator the other day, and she was talking all about this book someone's written, and she's like, and he forgot to mention that he's like the leading scientist in XYZ, right? And it's so funny because people have been taught to be modest, and this is an exercise in sort of bragging rights. Who is something that people neglect in their query letters. They might have no platform whatsoever, but they know a lot of people who are authors and they have those sort of connections, and they forget to mention it in a letter. So you're absolutely right. It's like, I always say, like, step into your future self. You're a writer now, but someday you'll be an author. You have to believe that before anyone else does. That's how I want you to be crafting your query letter.
And what about like the form of a query letter? Like, let's just say that I had to just dash one off real quick. I have 2 seconds, and just help me out. Like, what does it need to look like?
Yeah. So it's the introduction, which could be a variety of tactics. It could be, hey, Lucinda, I'm contacting you today because I read Charlie Daly's book and it really moved me, and I think I'm writing a similar book. It could be, sort of hit us with like an amazing platform statistic. In 3 years, I've accomplished however many followers or people. I've been doing X number of speaking events, or I've already received this blurb about my novel. So I hate the sort of formal approach of like, I am writing a novel of 84,000 words and historical fiction. Sometimes they forget the genre entirely. It's like you kind of want to paint again the why for the book before you start talking about the what of the book. Um, I'm trying to say some other sort of things, but like you could lead with your credentials. You could lead with the big idea. You could lead with the comps for, why we might start to get excited about this. Or the personalization, the just like trying to establish rapport. So I try to give a formula for it and get signed. I've got a page in it called Anatomy of a Query Letter in my attempt to make it as formulaic and paint by numbers as possible. But the truth of it is, book publishing is an art, not a science. I always say, like, get out your paintbrush. This is your palette. The query letter is your opportunity to just like put all of these wonderful things about you in your book in one place.
That's great. Yeah, and folks at home, read Get Signed. I think you've made it really easy for anybody who gets pestered about like, oh, you got published. How do I get published? It's like, just read Get Signed. You'll be fine.
Yeah, I think a lot of people through our book, but mainly through the courses and the coaching we do, have realized, and obviously this happens with clients also. I want to say it happened with us, Charlie. It's like the book you think you were meant to write is a very different one after you have read this book or done coaching with us. You come out of it saying like, oh, there was actually a much bigger book I could have written. And this is never more true than in nonfiction, but I'd say it applies to fiction also, because there are more characters to expand on. There's more scene setting to do. There's more people you want to kill. Like whatever it becomes, the shape can drastically change. The pitch is a diagnostic tool for the weaknesses in a manuscript, always. That's why editors at first pitch will sort of like start to have their reservations, or they'll jump all in within minutes. They'll say, send that to me. Or something about your pitch has already like kind of overtly pointed to a gap in the manuscript itself, which means that if you're a writer listening to this podcast and you want to get an agent or a book deal in any way, or just hybrid or self-publish your book, your pitch is going to, don't be daunted, upset, or surprised that when you do the exercise of writing a pitch, you have to go back into that book proposal or that manuscript and revamp the big idea or change the audience or do something a bit different than what you expected.
I found that, and I know in the last episode, you and I talked about like high concept elements and how even in fiction, you're often looking for how you can tie something into a current event or a cultural conversation.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
And I've noticed people miss that a lot, like a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like if I were to, let's say I were to pitch the writing I'm doing around my kayaking and stuff. And, I might be like, yeah, and I got into it because I was a hyperactive kid and whatever. It's like, oh, like there's an ADHD storyline. That's a huge topic. And there is a readership for that. So why don't you, like, yes, it can be about other things, but that's like, put that front and center would be my inclination.
Absolutely. I mean, the book proposal is a whole other bonus podcast we could do, but
yes.
What becomes really tough about book proposals is you keep having to come back to that opening page again and again and again. And the easiest way I try to guide nonfiction authors to do it now is just start writing the friggin' introduction to the book. It's got to meet the reader right where they are, right what they need, right in the journey, instead of trying to step outside and create it like you're about to give a PowerPoint deck. That might be comfortable for many CEOs I work with, but it's actually not what editors and readers want to see, because they want to just be immediately spoken to. And we're literary people, which means we're also cinematic people. We have to be really seeing like what's happening here and how is it gripping us. And if you can do that in the opening of your proposal, you've already hooked us, right? So that's the most important thing you can give time to.
And again, I think that's a whole separate podcast, but that element of how storytelling is always visual. I think even if it's nonfiction, I would imagine the percentage of people who think in concepts or sounds or smells or whatever is probably 0.00001% or something.
Absolutely. And in pitch letters, it's that in micro form, which I know makes it tougher. But if you're talking about memoir, because I know a lot of your listeners are writing memoir, I think of memoir the same way as fiction. It's like, don't neglect those little details that suggest there's a sweeping drama here, great scenery, little quirks or memorable sort of characteristics about characters are often neglected in pitches. It's like just Josephine was this, she meets Greg, they go on a journey through the Middle East, and it's sort of like, well, tell us a little bit more about either of these people and why we should care. Like, how are we going to get rooted in them? What's going to happen in this book? What journey are you going to take us in nonfiction? What's the transformation that happens at the end of the day? Anne Patchett has a line, every story has a beginning, middle, and end. An agent should be seeing that from a bird's eye view in your pitch, not like, okay, I got to one detail here about the book.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. So last thing, I try to keep these bonus episodes super short.
Yeah.
But from your point of view, your inbox, what is something, like if someone is trying to pitch to you or write a query, or to anyone, what's something that it's going to make you like, you're going to have to read it. You can't not open it. It's not going to get, like, it might not be a yes, but you're at the very least, they will have your attention.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I thought you were going to ask the opposite question of what turns me off entirely, which is another question I get.
Let's do that one next. Maybe start there. What's like your
let's start
never
there.
Again, you don't want to see this in your inbox.
Yeah, anything, and it's really hard to tell, right? But anything that feels trite, generic, like we've heard it all before, coupled with the kind of memoir of life lessons from one person. So we're like, those lessons aren't sounding very fresh. This person is an unknown. They have some like driving catharsis or reason to share their story, but they have no indication or proof from the market that the market wants to hear it or knows who that person is. That becomes an immediate kind of eye roll for me. And just like, it's a death sentence for, memoirs, already the toughest category. If it's going to be just one person's insular story and worldview, that doesn't read like a story that is going to touch readers or make an impact in a big way. So that's always a little bit of an eye roll. And some of these people have had amazing stories, but they just fail to capture how they're already impacting, like that proof of concept that they have the audience, or what's different about these lessons, or what's so dramatic about the story, what's going to keep us like watching it on a screen, because that's how we need to consider it. So those are the the millennial term that like, it gives me the ick. Like that's sort of the kind of query that does. And then the ones that make me jump out of my seat, quote unquote, I'm such a sucker for entrepreneurs who have sort of tapped into a new methodology, a new way of leading, a new way of seeing the world in, mission-driven books. And that can include people who are health wellness oriented, or it could be sheer business books. It could be philanthropists, activists. Those are the sorts of books that really get me excited immediately. And even more so if there is a practical dimension, because so many of my contacts want that action-oriented applicability that sounds really fresh. But honestly, Charlie, nothing gets you out of your seat like a great title.
Yes. Oh, and those are so hard.
They're so hard, but it's almost like, I won't tell you the title of the book that I'm writing next, but it's a bold title, and I sort of have to invent the book around it. And I've already received pushback from editors about the title, because they're like, it's a little negative. It's sort of, it's not promising to the reader. And I'm like, I hear you. I'm still going to go this way with my title, because how many times have I seen authors dilute, dumb down, try to like fit into the market what their title should organically be, and it's a mistake. So just be bold with it. You can't win. You can't lose by being bold and controversial with your title.
Yeah, it seems like with your query in general, because it seems to me, and I don't know that we would be having the same conversation like 50 years ago or something like that, but for my generation at least, there's a real tendency towards like following the rules and people pleasing and ticking boxes. And you probably got your education. I mean, like this came up on another episode where like I wasn't a very good student and I am still trying to get like there's a residue of certain writing habits from doing assignments to get the grades to get into the schools, whatever.
Totally.
And I feel like none of that. I mean, I always think of like conversations I've had with ghostwriting clients where the thing that gets me the job is something that would probably get me fired in a different context, or at least would be like wildly inappropriate to talk about at work.
Yeah, so funny.
And I don't know. I mean, I guess that's the thing too, is like you're not applying for a job. You're not trying to smooth talk HR.
Yeah, I think the more that you are yourself if we're now talking about interviews, because that is different from like the formal pitch that you put on paper where there does need to be a polish to it. There does need to be a thoughtfulness. But I think that when you can personally connect with someone in the room and sort of embrace your quirkiness, the personality that you are, that's a sign of confidence. I mean, I often tell entry-level folks at my company or elsewhere, when you're being too formal and too rote, it's sort of like it shows your youth and that you don't, and your inexperience. And so like I came in, I started this company at 27. A lot of that was just like chutzpah and entitlement. You know, I thought that I could talk to adults who had much more experience, who are much more famous or much more successful, the same way I talk to anyone. I've always had that kind of like, we're all leveling here. And that sense you fake until you make it, you step into that authority, people begin to take you seriously. So now I just kind of, I'm a different kind of agent.
I love the idea of a bonus episode sometime on proposals. And I think the dating analogies are like right themselves in this.
So much. Yeah, so much so. I hope it's helpful. I hope that's helpful.
Oh, I think people are going to get a lot out of this one. Lucinda, thank you so much for coming back.
Amazing. This was so much fun. Let's do it every week. It's just we had an immediate connection and now we've got all these projects together and it's a great, you are a great success story of how to contact and secure a literary agent because you didn't do things the conventional slush pile way. You use your podcast as a way to make connections. You use social media as a way to make connections. And, people like me can spot those kinds of ideator crusaders that I talk about in the book right away and want to be in business with them. So yeah, you should tell your own story sometime.
Yeah, no, that's coming. And I loved your suggestion too, to have Dominique on the podcast.
I was about to say, you got to have Dominique on. This is like, I can't wait for you and Dominique to have a podcast together. We're
making that happen soon. And and I think like I can relate though to what you're saying of almost this. I mean, and there's someone, I won't spoil it, but there's someone coming up who talks about how there can be a real advantage in not knowing you can't do something. And I think sometimes, it's just, I don't know, like I've always had the attitude of like, everyone has an email address. If you're not being like rude and annoying,
exactly. That's really interesting. So you just are always taking your stab at it, and then you realize that I can't do this. I'm exactly the same way. Like ask for forgiveness, not permission.
Yeah, and and you hardly ever have to ask for. Nobody's ever been like, oh, like why would you contact me with a query letter? That's like your job is to get query letters. If you're
and so I say to writers too. I'm like, follow up. What's the worst thing? They don't respond to it. They tell you stop contacting. They were going to do that anyway. So what is the worst thing? What do you stand to lose? This is your book. This is your baby. Like nothing could be more important. So anyway,
love it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Charlie. Talk to you soon. Send this to me. I might have a little edit.
Sounds good. Yeah, always.
Bye. Take care.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Lucinda's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.